This semester, we're going to cover quite a few topics, so let's get started. The first thing to talk about is what is wildlife. The word wildlife is uniquely North American. Other languages don't really speak to this. Our concern for wildlife began in the last half of the 1800s, although possibly traced back to game management of Europe. It became an issue in our time because of the widespread and uncontrolled logging throughout most of the eastern forests. The rise of conservation included both wildlife and timber resources. Here is a definition of wildlife. As you read this, think about what you think of when you think of wildlife. The history of wildlife management is very interesting. Prior to 1900, there was very little regulation. The U.S. was seen as unlimited wildlife that was available for us to hunt and do with as we wished. So more about the history of wildlife management. One of the first presidents that really supported wildlife management was Theodore Roosevelt. And you can certainly look up more information about that online. But the extinction of the passenger pigeon and particularly the buffalo really raised public concern over the future of our wild animals. The first refuge, Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, was set aside by Roosevelt in 1903. And Paul Krogel, you see here in the picture on Pelican Island, pursued this sanctuary for birds because of the use of bird feathers in fashion hats particularly, but in fashion in general. And these birds were being killed merely for a feather that someone could put in their hats at that time. The first act to keep from taking wildlife was the Lacey Act of 1900, which made it illegal to transport and sell wildlife between states and made that a federal offense. We'll talk a lot about Aldo Leopold. Our first forum talks to that, and we'll discuss a reading of his. And he is considered the father of wildlife management. And through Leopold's influence, the term game management is how people thought of wildlife management at that time, and simply that's what it was. Most of the issues with wildlife are related to game. And so that is how this field began. In 1933, you can see here a list of bullets that talks about what happened in that year and why it was significant. The book Game Management was published. I recommend highly that you obtain that book. It's readily available. The Wildlife Society was founded, an incredible organization, very active today. In fact, American Public University and American Military University have a student chapter of the Wildlife Society that you can join. The Journal of Wildlife Management began, and the first cooperative wildlife research units were established. So here's a picture of what I was speaking about earlier, which is the feather hat and the fur wrap. And the piles of buffalo or bison bones you see on the right. You see all of the weekend hunting there. This is what was going on. Had that not happened, and had we not started to regulate wildlife, or game at that time as it was called, there would not have been a profession in wildlife management. But also, you have to wonder what really would be left of so many more species. Beaver and whitetail were nearly driven to extinction by overharvesting. Not only have these species rebounded, but for example, the beaver was reintroduced in many areas. one in Virginia, Prince William Forest Park in the National Park Service. Before it was National Park Service, it was a recreation demonstration area, and at that time, beaver were reintroduced. It was 1950, 1952. The same is true of white-tailed deer. In a lot of areas, it had to be reintroduced. And because they're so common today, few people even realize that they almost were extirpated. So in summary, this discipline evolved from game management. Game management came about due to the interest of President Theodore Roosevelt and obviously other influential people that were mentioned earlier, like Aldo Leopold. The states actually not only manage game, but in most states they own the game. Even if, for example, you're a federal entity within a state, typically, unless there's a law that says otherwise, the state owns the game. And then finally, federal wildlife management began with the Lacey Act of 1900. And here are some references for you to link to.